December 1287. 30,000 Mongol warriors crossed into Poland under a winter sky so cold that horses' breath hung in the air like smoke from unseen fires. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were the descendants of Genghis Khan's unstoppable war machine, the same force that had conquered everything from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. They had every reason to be confident. Poland had been easy prey before. Twice before, they had devastated this land so thoroughly that entire generations grew up knowing the Mongol hordes as the horsemen of the apocalypse itself. But in 46 days, they would retreat forever, never to return, never to threaten Poland again. This is the story of how one man spent 46 years preparing for 46 days. A man who watched his world burn when he was 5 years old. A man who turned trauma into obsession and obsession into victory. His name was Leszek the Black. And this is how he stopped what everyone believed was unstoppable. April 9th, 1241, the city of Krakow. 5-year-old Leszek crouched in the darkness of the castle cellar, his small hands pressed against the stone wall. Through a crack in the foundation, he could see flames, orange and red and terrible. The wooden buildings of Krakow's outer districts were burning. His nurse, an old woman named Dobrosława, held him tight, her hand over his mouth to keep him silent. But Leszek didn't want to scream. He wanted to understand. Why were the buildings burning? Where was his father? Where was his uncle, Duke Henry the Pious, who had ridden out 3 days ago with all the knights? The answer came with the thunder of hooves. Mongol cavalry, thousands of them, pouring through streets that had never seen war like this. Their composite bows sang death. Their arrows found flesh with mechanical precision. The screams rose and fell like waves against rocks. Leszek watched through that crack in the stone, watched the city his family ruled turn to ash, watched refugees run toward the castle gates, only to be cut down before they could reach safety. Watched the wooden palisades that were supposed to protect them burn like kindling. His mind, young, boy, and unformed, tried to make sense of the chaos. It settled on one simple truth that would haunt him for 47 years. Wood burns, stone doesn't. Then the messenger came, a knight covered in blood, half his armor torn away. Leszek could hear his father, Duke Conrad of Masovia, speaking with him in the hall above. The words filtered down through the floorboards. Duke Henry is dead. Leszek felt Dobrosława's grip tighten. At Legnica, the Mongols, they beheaded him, put his head on a pike outside the city gates. 5-year-old Leszek didn't fully understand what beheaded meant, but he understood dead. He understood pike. He understood that his uncle, the bravest man he knew, the man who wore shining armor and rode at the front of every procession, was gone. His father's voice came next, low and broken. Remember this, all of you. Remember what happens when we face them unprepared. Remember how wood burns and men die. Leszek pressed his eye closer to the crack, watching Krakow burn. And he remembered. To understand why what happened in 1287 was so shocking, you need to understand just how catastrophic 1241 had been. The Mongol invasion of that year wasn't just a military defeat. It was an apocalypse that shattered the Polish psyche. The Mongols had perfected warfare to a degree that medieval Europe couldn't comprehend. At the heart of their power was cavalry. Every Mongol soldier was born in the saddle, learning to ride before they could properly walk. These weren't the heavily armored knights of Europe who charged in straight lines. Mongol horsemen were light, mobile, and deadly accurate with their composite bows. They could shoot while riding at full gallop. They could hit targets at distances European soldiers couldn't match. And they had mastered the art of the feigned retreat, the tactical maneuver that had destroyed countless armies who thought they were winning. Here's how it worked. How Mongol forces would engage an enemy, fight briefly, then suddenly break and run. The opposing army, thinking they had won, would break formation and chase after them. Then the trap would spring. Hidden Mongol units would emerge from the flanks. The retreating soldiers would wheel around, and the pursuing enemy would find themselves surrounded and annihilated. Duke Henry the Pious had led 25,000 men to Legnica to stop them. Polish knights, reinforcements from Greater Poland, Templar knights sent by the Pope himself. It should have been enough. It wasn't even close. The Mongols used smoke screens to hide their movements. Some chroniclers claim they even shouted commands in Polish through the smoke, yelling, "Flee," to sow confusion. Whether that detail is true or not, the result was undeniable. Total annihilation. Henry died on that battlefield. His body was so mutilated that his widow could only identify him by counting his toes. He had 6 on his left foot. The Mongols mounted his head on a spear and showed it to the defenders of nearby cities, trying to break their will. The message was clear. Resistance is futile. After Legnica, there was no organized Polish defense. The Mongols swept through the land like a plague. Kraków fell in hours. Its wooden citadel, the same one where young Leszek hid, might as well have been made of paper. The Mongols burned it to the ground and moved on. Over 20 cities destroyed, over 100,000 dead, an entire generation traumatized. And then, as suddenly as they came, the Mongols withdrew. Not because they were defeated, but because their great Khan had died in Mongolia, and the commanders needed to return for the succession crisis. Poland buried its dead and began to rebuild. Young Leszek grew up in the ashes of that devastation, the memory of flames seared into his mind. 1259, 18 years after the first nightmare. Leszek was 23 years old now, Duke of Sieradz and Łęczyca, a capable military commander in his own right. He had spent his entire adult life studying warfare, reading chronicles, interviewing veterans of Legnica, learning everything he could about the enemy who had destroyed his world when he was 5, and now they were back. The scouts brought the news in autumn. Mongol armies massing on the eastern border, the same pattern, the same tactics, the nightmare returning. This time, Poland tried to be ready. Leszek himself led 500 knights to defend the approaches to Sandomierz. He had studied the Mongol feigned retreat. He knew not to pursue. He knew to hold formation. But knowing and doing are different things when arrows rain from the sky and your men are dying around you. The battle lasted 3 hours. Leszek's formation held for the first hour. Then a Mongol flanking force emerged from a forest he thought was empty. Then his cavalry's horses panicked under the arrow storm. Then the retreat became a rout. Leszek survived by luck and the speed of his horse. 2/3 of his men didn't. He rode through the countryside toward Kraków, watching the same scenes he remembered from childhood play out again. Villages burning, refugees fleeing, the Mongol cavalry everywhere, unstoppable, inevitable. Sandomierz fell. Kraków fell. Lublin, Zawichost, Bytom, all sacked, all burned. The wooden fortifications that had been rebuilt after 1241 proved just as useless the second time around. Leszek stood in the ruins of Kraków for the second time in his life. This time he wasn't a terrified child. He was a grown man, a military commander, a duke, and he had failed. He looked at the blackened timber where the castle's wooden walls had stood, touched the ash with his fingers. Around him, survivors searched through rubble for bodies of loved ones. "I was a child then," he said to no one in particular. "I have no excuse now." His sister Gryfina found him there. She was 27, old enough to remember 1241, young enough to have believed it wouldn't happen again. Blood stained her dress from tending to the wounded. "What do we do?" she asked. Leszek stood silent for a long moment, staring at the ruins. When he spoke, his voice was cold and certain. "Give me 30 years. I'll turn Poland into a fortress they cannot break." 30 years? Gryfina looked at her brother like he'd lost his mind. "Leszek, we need to rebuild now. We need stone." He pointed at the foundations of destroyed buildings. "Look, The stone foundation survived. The cellars survived. Only the wood burned. We rebuild in wood, and in 30 years, when they come back, we burn again. You don't know they'll come back. Leszek met his sister's eyes. They came in 1241. They came in 1259. They'll come again. The only question is whether we'll be ready. He was right, of course, but even he didn't know how obsessive that preparation would become. The transformation of Poland between 1259 and 1287 was unprecedented. At the center of it all was Leszek the Black, driven by memories of flames and failure. He started with Krakow. The capital's old wooden citadel was completely demolished. In its place, stone by stone, rose a castle made entirely of stone. Not partially stone with wooden elements, entirely stone. The walls were thick enough to withstand battering rams and siege engines. The towers were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Crossbow emplacements lined the battlements. The cost was staggering. 45,000 silver marks over 6 years. For a duchy still recovering from 2 invasions, it was economic suicide. Nobles protested. They wanted money for armies, for cavalry, for swords and armor. Leszek refused every petition. Dead armies don't defend, he told them. Stone walls outlive us all. He didn't stop with Krakow. Sandomierz received the same treatment. Then Wyszlika, then castle after castle across Lesser Poland. Anywhere the Mongols had struck, anywhere they might strike again. Leszek built stone fortifications. But the fortifications were only part of his preparation. Leszek did something the Mongols themselves had mastered. He built an intelligence network. For 10 years, he sent scouts into Ruthenia, the lands beyond Poland's eastern border where the Mongol Golden Horde held sway. These weren't just observers, they were spies. They learned the language, they cultivated contacts, they listened to rumors in markets and taverns, and in 1286 they brought him the most valuable intelligence of all. The commanders planning the next Polish invasion hated each other, Talabuga Khan and Nogai Khan. 2 powerful leaders within the Golden Horde, both ambitious, both convinced of their own tactical genius, both utterly unwilling to coordinate or share glory. Leszek read the reports in his war room in Krakow, and for the first time in 27 years, he smiled. "They're coming divided," he said to Pakosław of Wyszlica, his most trusted military advisor. Pakosław was 55 now, a veteran of the 1259 disaster, scarred and bitter. Talabuga will lead one column, Nogai another. They won't support each other, won't coordinate their assaults. "You're certain?" Pakosław asked. "My scouts have watched them argue at council meetings. Talabuga believes in methodical siege warfare. Nogai favors quick raids. They despise each other's tactics almost as much as they despise each other." Leszek stood and walked to the window. Outside, the stone walls of Krakow rose against the sky, impregnable, ready. "Let them come divided," he said quietly. "We'll destroy them separately." November 1287. 28 years after Leszek's vow. 46 years after the first invasion. Leszek stood atop the battlements of Krakow Castle, looking out over the city he had spent 3 decades fortifying. He was 51 years old now. His hair, once black, was streaked with gray. His face was lined with the weight of preparation and command. Below him, the city went about its evening business. Merchants closing shops, families gathering for dinner, children playing in streets that had run with blood when their grandparents were young. They didn't know, the common people didn't know what was coming. But Leszek knew. His scouts had brought word 3 days ago. 30,000 Mongol warriors crossing the border, Talabuga's northern column with 20,000 men. Nogai's southern force with 10,000, the 3rd invasion. The one Leszek had spent his adult life preparing for. His sister Gryfina joined him on the battlements. She was 55 now, managing the city's supply logistics and medical preparations. She'd become the most efficient quartermaster in Poland, driven by the same memories that haunted her brother. "The granaries are full," she said. 6 months of grain. The wells are deep. We can hold for a year if we have to." Leszek nodded but said nothing. "You were right," Grafina continued, "about everything. The stone, the preparation, the intelligence, all of it." "I haven't been right yet," Leszek replied. "Being right means surviving. Being right means they don't burn us this time." He touched the stone merlin beside him, cool and solid, immovable. He thought of the crack in the cellar wall 46 years ago, the crack through which a 5-year-old boy had watched his world burn. "Third time," he whispered. "This time is different." Grafina placed a hand on her brother's shoulder. "This time, we're ready." From the east, beyond the horizon, beyond the forests and rivers, 30,000 warriors were riding toward them. Warriors who had conquered half the known world. Warriors who expected easy plunder, scattered resistance, quick victory. But they were riding toward walls they couldn't burn. Toward a defender who had studied their every tactic. Toward a man who had turned childhood trauma into a lifetime of preparation. They were riding toward Leszek the Black, and he was waiting. The stone walls of Krakow stood silent against the November sky, silent and ready. In 46 days, those walls would prove that the unstoppable could be stopped, that the invincible could be defeated, that sometimes the greatest victory isn't won in a day, but across a lifetime of refusing to make the same mistake 3 times. December was coming, and with it, the last Mongol invasion Poland would ever face. December 7th, 1287, the Red River crossing, eastern border of Poland. Dawn light broke across frozen water, turning ice to silver as the first Mongol scouts crossed into Polish territory. Their horses' breath hung in the frigid air like the souls of the dead. Behind them, stretched back along the frozen road for 5 miles, came an army that had conquered empires, 20,000 warriors under Talabuga Khan's command, horses bred on the steppes, trained from birth for war. Siege equipment that had breached the walls of cities from Persia to the Carpathians, supply wagons carrying everything needed for a campaign that was supposed to last 6 weeks, the machinery of conquest, refined over generations, rolling forward with terrible inevitability. Talabuga himself rode at the center of the column, a man in his mid-40s who had commanded Mongol armies since before most of his soldiers were born. His face was weathered by wind and sun and the smoke of 100 burning cities. He had fought in Persia, where resistance had been crushed so thoroughly that entire provinces ceased to exist. He had raided into Hungary, where the memory of Mongol hooves still woke children screaming in the night. And he had studied the previous Polish campaigns with the thoroughness of a man who believed in learning from history. He knew that in 1241 and 1259, Poland had fallen in weeks. Wooden fortifications that burned like kindling, scattered defenders who couldn't coordinate, predictable tactics that made them easy prey. This would be no different. Poland was Poland, weak, fragmented, unable to learn from its own defeats. 200 miles to the south, under the same winter dawn, Nogai Khan crossed the border with 10,000 elite cavalry. These weren't the mixed forces Talabuga commanded with Ruthenian vassals whose loyalty was always questionable. These were pure Mongol and Turkic warriors, men who had been born in the saddle, who could shoot arrows with devastating accuracy while riding at full gallop, who knew no other life than conquest. Nogai was younger than Talabuga, barely 35, and that youth made him hungry in ways the older commander had forgotten. Hungry for glory, hungry to prove he was the superior tactician, hungry to be the one who took Krakow while his rival fumbled around in the northern territories trying to besiege mud-walled towns. He pushed his column hard that first day, covering 30 miles before making camp. Speed was everything. Get to Krakow before Talabuga could claim any significant victories. Take the capital. Force the Poles to surrender. Return to the Golden Horde with treasure and slaves and the kind of reputation that made lesser men bow their heads. Neither commander knew they were riding into a trap 46 years in the making. Neither knew that every mile they advanced brought them closer to a defender who had spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this moment. Neither knew that this time Poland was ready. The news reached Krakow on December 8th, carried by a rider whose horse was half dead from exhaustion, foam streaming from its mouth, legs trembling from being pushed beyond endurance. The scout didn't wait for ceremony or protocol. He went straight to Leszek's war room, where Poland's defense was being coordinated. 2 columns, the scout reported, still breathing hard, his words coming in gasps. Talabuga north, 20,000 strong, heading toward Sandomierz. Nogay south, 10,000 elite cavalry, moving fast toward the capital. They crossed the border at dawn yesterday. Leszek stood over a map table, studying positions marked with wooden pieces representing forces and fortifications. Around him waited his commanders. Pakosław of Wyszlica, 55 years old now, scarred from 2 previous invasions, his face a roadmap of battles survived and friends lost. Gryfina, managing supply logistics with the efficiency of someone who understood that wars were won by grain and water as much as by swords. And the youngest of them, Zbigniew of Ostrog, 28 years old, burning with the need to prove himself in battle. "They're separated," Zbigniew said immediately, his hand moving to the map, fingers tracing the routes. "We should concentrate our forces, hit 1 column with everything we have, crush them before they can unite." Leszek didn't look up from the map. His eyes followed the terrain, the distances, the timing. 46 years of preparation had taught him to see not just where forces were, but where they would be. Not just what was happening, but what would happen next. "And which column would you hit?" he asked quietly. "Talabuga's. He's closer and has more men. If we defeat him decisively, Nogay will retreat rather than face us alone." "You think like they want you to think." Leszek's finger traced the routes on the map with deliberate slowness. "They expect us to mass our forces for a single decisive battle. That's what Duke Henry did at Legnica. That's what I tried to do in 1259. It's where they excel. Open field, mobile warfare, cavalry against cavalry. That's their game, Zbigniew. They've been playing it for 3 generations. They're better at it than we'll ever be." "Then what's your game?" There was an edge to Zbigniew's voice. The young knight had trained his entire life for this moment. He'd studied warfare, practiced with sword and lance until his hands bled, dreamed of the glory that came from defeating Poland's ancient enemy. And now his duke was talking about not fighting them. Leszek finally looked up. His eyes, dark and cold as winter stone, swept across his commanders. When he spoke, every word carried the weight of 28 years of planning. "We make them play ours." He pointed to Sandomierz on the map. "Talabuga will reach here in 4 days. The garrison is 300 men under Bolesław, Pakosław's nephew. The walls are stone, 15 feet high, 3 feet thick. Crossbow emplacements every 20 yards. Catapults positioned for overlapping fields of fire. They'll hold." "Against 20,000? Zbigniew shook his head. "That's suicide. 300 men can't hold against those odds." "That's exactly the point." Leszek moved his finger to other fortified positions scattered across the map. "We don't meet them in open battle where their cavalry can maneuver and their tactics can shine. We force them to siege fortified cities. Every day they spend battering walls that won't break is a day they're not plundering. A day their supplies dwindle. A day winter gets worse. A day their campaign season shortens." Pakosław, who had been silent until now, his old eyes studying the map with the weariness of a man who had seen this plan fail before, spoke up. "And when they bypass the fortified cities, when they simply ride around our walls and raid the countryside instead, we can't defend every village, every farm. Then local forces harass them, make every raid costly, make them bleed for every farm they burn, every slave they take." Leszek's finger traced the territory between Sandomierz and Krakow, touching each small fortification, each militia position. "Coordinated resistance. Telegraph riders carry warnings ahead of their advance. Militias equipped with crossbows hit their raiding parties and disappear before they can respond. And when they're tired, frustrated, spread thin, their supplies running low, their men dying in small skirmishes they can't prevent, that's when we hit them with everything we have. The room fell silent. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the first heavy snow of what promised to be a brutal winter. The kind of winter that killed armies that weren't prepared for it. Zbigniew broke the silence, and there was anger in his voice now. Real anger, not just frustration. You're asking soldiers to hide behind walls while the enemy ravages our land. You're asking us to watch villages burn and do nothing. That's not war, my lord. That's cowardice. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every man there felt it. The shift from strategic discussion to something more dangerous, more personal. Leszek walked slowly around the map table, his boots echoing on stone floors, until he stood face to face with the young knight. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Zbigniew take an involuntary step back. "My uncle charged bravely at Legnica," Leszek said. "Duke Henry the Pious, the bravest man I ever knew. He led 25,000 men against the Mongols in open battle. Knights, crusaders, the finest warriors Poland could gather. His head decorated a Mongol spear by sunset. I charged bravely in 1259 with 500 knights at my back. 2/3 of my men died screaming in a forest while I ran for my life. You want to talk to me about bravery, Zbigniew? Bravery is choosing the tactic that wins, not the one that feels heroic." Zbigniew's hand moved toward his sword hilt. For a moment the room balanced on the edge of violence. Then Pakosław stepped between them, one hand raised. "Enough," the old veteran said. His voice carried the authority of a man who had earned every scar on his body. "We have an enemy at the gates. Save your anger for them." Leszek turned back to his map, his moment of anger controlled, channeled back into cold calculation. "This is the strategy. Fortified cities hold their positions. Local forces harass enemy raiding parties. Main army remains mobile. Strikes when the opportunity is right. Anyone who can't follow these orders can leave my command now." No one left. But Zbigniew's jaw was set, his eyes burning with the need to prove himself, to show that young warriors could still win glory. Leszek knew that look. He'd worn it himself once. 28 years ago, right before his disastrous charge that had accomplished nothing but getting good men killed. Some lessons, he thought, watching the young knight struggle with his pride, can only be learned in blood. He just hoped Zbigniew would survive learning them. December 12, 1287. Sandomierz. Talabuga's advance force reached the city 5 days ahead of the schedule his scouts had predicted. The Mongols were always fast. That was part of what made them terrifying. They could cover distances in days that European armies needed weeks to traverse. Speed was a weapon they wielded as effectively as their bows. Bolesław, the 30-year-old knight commanding Sandomierz's garrison, stood on the battlements and watched 20,000 warriors deploy around his city like a noose tightening. He had 300 men, veterans, well-trained, equipped with the best weapons Polish forges could produce, but 300 against 20,000. The odds were absurd. In any other circumstance, in any other war, they would be suicide. But Bolesław also had walls that his uncle Pakosław had spent 10 years building, stone walls that didn't burn. Stone walls 3 feet thick that arrows couldn't penetrate and battering rams would break themselves against. Stone walls that had cost more silver marks than the entire annual revenue of Sandomierz, that had required stonemasons brought from as far as Italy, that had bankrupted the duchy treasury twice during their construction. Time to find out if they were worth it. The Mongol assault began on December 13th, an hour after dawn, when the winter sun was still low and weak. Wave after wave of horse archers rode close to the walls, wheeling in practiced formations, unleashing volleys of arrows meant to suppress the defenders and cover assault troops moving forward with ladders and siege equipment. They were met with return fire from crossbows positioned along the battlements. The crossbows had been manufactured specifically for this purpose, designed to have range that Mongol composite bows couldn't match. Warriors fell from their horses 200 yards from the walls, surprised, confused that defenders could reach them at such distance. Then the catapults opened up, 3 of them positioned at strategic points along the wall where their fields of fire overlapped. Stones the size of a man's head, launched with mechanical precision, arced through the air and crashed into Mongol formations with devastating effect. Horses screamed and scattered. Men died crushed under rocks they never saw coming. The neat cavalry formations that were the foundation of Mongol tactics dissolved into chaos. The assault parties with their ladders never reached the walls. Caught in the killing zone between crossbow range and catapult fire, taking casualties with every step, they broke and retreated. The assault failed. Talabuga, watching from his command position half a mile away, felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in Poland before. Doubt. They tried again the next day. Bigger force, better coordination, attacking from multiple sides simultaneously to divide the defenders' attention. Failed again, and again, and again. For 6 days, Talabuga threw his warriors against Sandomier's walls. For 6 days, the stone held. The defenders lost 40 men, mostly to lucky arrow shots through gaps in the battlements. The Mongols lost hundreds. On the evening of December 18th, Talabuga called off the siege. His commanders gathered in his tent, and for the first time in this campaign, you could feel doubt creeping into the room like winter cold seeping through walls. "These aren't the walls we faced before," one commander said, stating the obvious because someone had to say it out loud. "The Poles have learned something," another added. "This isn't 1241, this isn't 1259. Talabuga stared at the map of Poland spread before him on the campaign table, thinking of the reports he'd read from previous invasions. Easy victories, quick sieges, wooden fortifications that burned or broke within hours. Cities that fell so fast, the Mongol forces barely had time to deploy their full strength. This was different. This was wrong. This was not how Poland was supposed to defend itself. "Bypass it," he ordered, making the only decision that made strategic sense. "Move toward the Święty Mountains. There are smaller towns there. Easier targets. We'll come back to Sandomier's later if we have time." But as his column moved northwest the next morning, leaving Sandomier's unconquered behind them, every warrior in his army felt it. The first crack in their confidence. The first hint that this invasion might not follow the familiar script of easy conquest and quick plunder. In Krakow, when the messenger brought news that Sandomir still stood after 6 days of assault, Leszek allowed himself a smile. The first genuine smile in weeks. Stage 1 complete. The walls held. December 20th, 1287, near the town of Łąko, in the foothills of the Święty Mountains. Talabuga's column had shrunk. Raiding parties had split off over the past week, sent to plunder farms and small villages, searching for the easy victories that Sandomir had denied them. The main force, now down to perhaps 8,000 warriors, moved through terrain that was all wrong for cavalry operations. The Święty Mountains weren't mountains in the Alpine sense, nothing like the Carpathians or the peaks of the Caucasus. But they were hills covered in dense forest, cut through with narrow valleys, crossed by rivers that ran fast and cold. Places where Mongol mobility meant nothing. Places where ambush was possible, even easy. Leszek had been tracking Talabuga's movements for days through a network of scouts and local informants, waiting for exactly this moment. When the Mongol column was depleted by detached raiding parties, when they were moving through unfavorable terrain, when they were frustrated by failure and off balance from facing resistance they hadn't expected. He had 4,000 men with him. Polish knights in heavy armor, cavalry from allied duchies who remembered 1241 and wanted revenge, and 1,500 Hungarian riders under Vojevoda György Czak. The Hungarians had lost as much as Poland in the first Mongol invasion. Some estimates said 20 to 40% of Hungary's population had died. They remembered, and they wanted blood just as badly as the Poles did. They hit Talabuga's column at midday on December 20th, when the winter sun was low and blinding, turning the snow-covered landscape into a field of white fire that made it hard to see, hard to judge distances. The attack came from three sides simultaneously. Hungarian cavalry from the south, emerging from forest cover that scouts should have detected but hadn't. Polish knights from the west, charging down a hillside with the momentum of gravity behind them, infantry with crossbows holding the eastern hills, positioned where they could rain death down on anyone trying to escape in that direction. The Mongols tried to execute their standard response, the tactic that had won them 100 battles across 3 continents. Feigned retreat to draw the attackers into pursuit, then encirclement and annihilation. The vanguard broke and retreated, warriors shouting in apparent panic, dropping weapons, seeming to flee in disorder, but Leszek had studied that tactic for 28 years. He had read every chronicle, interviewed every survivor of Legnica who could describe how it worked, analyzed every detail of how Duke Henry's forces had been lured into pursuing what they thought was a defeated enemy, only to find themselves surrounded and destroyed. His orders to every commander had been explicit, repeated until every man knew them by heart, brutal in their simplicity. Hold position. Do not pursue. Let them run. Make them come back to us. When the Mongol vanguard broke and retreated, the Polish lines didn't move. The knights sat on their horses, lances ready, shields up, waiting. The Hungarians held their position on the southern flank. The crossbowmen on the hills kept firing, targeting the retreating warriors, killing them as they fled. The Mongols had to come back. Their supply wagons were trapped in the valley behind the fighting. Their commander was surrounded. The feigned retreat only worked if the enemy pursued. If the enemy held position, the Mongols had to return to actual combat. For the first time in their Polish campaigns, the feigned retreat didn't work. The battle devolved into exactly what the Mongols wanted to avoid: a grinding, brutal, close-quarters fight where their mobility advantage disappeared. Heavy cavalry, when properly positioned and supported by infantry, could stand against mounted archers. Disciplined formations could weather arrow storms that would have broken lesser troops. And in close combat, Polish knights in full armor were more than a match for Mongol light cavalry. Leszek fought in the center of his line, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision. He was 51 years old, older than most of the warriors around him, his hair gray, his body carrying the aches of decades. But he was driven by something stronger than youth, driven by 46 years of preparation and memory, and the absolute certainty that this time the outcome would be different. Every Mongol who fell under his sword, he saw the flames of Krakow in 1241. Every Polish knight who held position against cavalry charges, he saw his uncle Duke Henry's beheaded corpse. Every hour the battle lasted without the Mongol tactics working, he felt vindication building in his chest like a prayer finally being answered. The fight lasted 6 hours. Winter afternoon faded into twilight, the sun setting early as it did in December, and still they fought. Snow turned to mud under thousands of hooves, mixed with blood until the ground looked like some artist's nightmare vision of hell. The air filled with the screams of horses and men, the clash of steel, the thud of arrows hitting shields and flesh. And then, incredibly, impossibly, the Mongols broke. Not a feigned retreat this time, real panic, real terror. The realization that they were losing, that the tactics that had never failed were failing now, that death was coming for them, and there was no clever maneuver that could stop it. Talabuga's forces, suffering mounting casualties, unable to achieve the quick victory they expected, their commander dead from an arrow through the throat, began to withdraw in earnest. The retreat became a rout. Warriors threw down weapons and spurred their horses toward any escape route they could find. Officers tried to rally them and were ignored or trampled. Polish chronicles would later describe the defeat as quite severe. That was medieval understatement for a complete disaster. It was a rout, a massacre, the destruction of a force that had thought itself invincible. Talabuga's column limped away from Wonko, having lost perhaps 2,000 men killed or captured, but more importantly, they'd lost something they couldn't quantify or replace: their aura of invincibility, the psychological advantage that came from being the army that had never lost in Poland. Leszek stood on the battlefield as darkness fell, surrounded by exhausted men and dying horses, the snow red beneath his feet. Pakosław rode up beside him, blood streaming from a cut above his eye, his armor dented in a dozen places. "We did it," the old veteran said, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "We actually did it. We defeated them in open battle." Leszek looked at the retreating Mongol army, their torches flickering in the distance like dying stars, growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared into the winter night. "This is one column," he said quietly. "Talabuga's force is broken, but Nogai is still coming, and he doesn't know yet that he should be afraid." But there, on that battlefield, with Mongol blood soaking into Polish soil for the first time in Polish history, something fundamental had shifted. The army that was supposed to plunder northern Poland with impunity had been defeated, forced to retreat, destroyed as a fighting force. For the first time in Mongol-Polish history, it was the invaders who were running away. The unstoppable had been stopped. December 24th, 1287, Christmas Eve. Nogai Khan arrived outside Kraków with 10,000 warriors, completely unaware that 300 miles to the north, his fellow commander's army had just been shattered. Communications between the two columns had been minimal by design. Talabuga and Nogai despised each other too much to coordinate properly, too proud to share intelligence, too competitive to work as a unified force. So Nogai approached Poland's capital with full confidence. His forces were fresh, untested by hard fighting. His men were elite Mongol and Turkic cavalry, the absolute best warriors the Golden Horde could field, men whose families had been serving in Mongol armies since Genghis Khan's time. And after all, they had taken Kraków twice before, in 1241, in 1259. Both times, the city had fallen in days. The playbook was simple, proven by decades of successful campaigns. Surround the city, breach the defenses through assault or siege, overwhelm the garrison, spend a few days plundering. Withdraw with treasure and slaves before winter made further campaigning impossible. But when Nogai's scouts returned from their initial reconnaissance with their reports, something in their voices gave him pause. "The walls," one of them said, and there was confusion in his voice, almost fear. "Commander, the walls are different." Nogai rode forward personally to observe, something he rarely did, preferring to command from a safe distance. What he saw made him rein in his horse sharply, made his tactical mind immediately begin recalculating. These weren't the wooden palisades of 1241 that had burned so easily. These weren't even the modest wooden and earth fortifications of 1259 that had required only days to breach. Kraków had transformed itself into a genuine fortress. The castle was entirely stone, massive blocks fitted together with precision that spoke of Italian engineering. The walls were thick and high, designed to withstand both assault and siege. Positioned along those walls were catapults and crossbows, lots of them, all pointing outward, all manned by defenders who looked ready to use them. Nogai sat on his horse for a long moment, studying the defenses with the eye of a man who had conquered cities from the Caucasus to the Carpathians. A younger commander might have been intimidated, but Nogai had decades of experience. Stone walls were just obstacles. Obstacles could be overcome with patience, proper siege tactics, and the willingness to accept casualties. On Christmas morning, as Christian Poland celebrated the birth of their Savior, as churches rang bells and families gathered for prayers, Nogai launched his first assault on Kraków, Waves of horse archers rode close to the walls, wheeling in practiced formations, unleashing volleys of arrows meant to suppress the defenders and create covering fire for assault troops. But the defenders were protected by stone battlements designed specifically to counter this tactic. The arrows that had devastated armies at Legnica, that had killed Duke Henry and thousands of his men, clattered harmlessly against rock. Crossbow bolts answered from the walls. Mongol warriors, accustomed to being the ones dealing death from distance, accustomed to enemies who couldn't shoot back effectively, found themselves targeted by weapons that could pierce their armor at ranges they thought were safe. Men fell from horses. Formations dissolved. The covering fire failed to cover anything. Then the catapults opened fire. Stones launched with mechanical precision crashed into cavalry formations. Horses panicked, throwing riders, trampling their own men. Warriors died crushed under projectiles they never saw coming. The careful Mongol tactics, honed over generations, fell apart in the face of defensive firepower they hadn't anticipated. When assault parties tried to approach the walls with siege equipment, ladders, and rams, they entered a kill zone where projectiles rained from multiple angles. Crossbow bolts from the front, catapult stones from above. Even boiling water and oil poured from murder holes built into the fortifications. The first assault wave broke within an hour, retreating in disorder, leaving hundreds dead at the base of walls they had never even reached. Nogai ordered a second assault, then a third, then a fourth. All failed. Inside the city, Leshek watched from the command tower. He hadn't been present for the siege's beginning, having been at Wonko, commanding the forces that shattered Talabuga's column. But he'd ridden hard to reach Krakow, killing 3 horses in 2 days to get back to the capital, and now he stood watching the Mongols batter themselves against walls he'd spent a decade building. Gryphina joined him in the tower, exhausted from coordinating the medical response to the siege. Despite days of intense fighting, casualties had been remarkably light. 15 defenders dead in 3 days of assaults against 10,000 attackers. Numbers that would have been impossible to believe if she hadn't seen them with her own eyes. "How long can we hold?" she asked. Leshek gestured to the supply warehouses visible from the tower, massive stone buildings filled with grain and salted meat and everything else needed to survive a long siege. 6 months of grain, deep wells for water. They'll run out of patience long before we run out of food. And if they just sit there, wait us out through the winter, then they accomplish nothing. Every day outside our walls is a day they're not plundering, not gaining treasure or slaves to justify this campaign. A day winter gets worse and their horses consume supplies they can't replace. A day their campaign season shortens. He turned to his sister. Sieges are supposed to be fast for them. Get in, plunder, get out before the weather turns or enemy reinforcements arrive. This is turning into everything they wanted to avoid. A grinding war of attrition where their cavalry means nothing. On the walls below, defenders cheered as another Mongol assault broke and retreated, warriors streaming back toward their camp, leaving more bodies behind. The sound echoed across the city. Hope, Leshek thought. They're feeling hope. For the first time in living memory, Poles were watching Mongols fail. They're starting to believe we can actually win this. The siege ground on for days that felt like weeks. December 26th, 27th, 28th. Each day, Nogai tried new tactics, night assaults using darkness to approach the walls undetected, concentrated attacks on perceived weak points, attempts to undermine the walls through tunneling. Nothing worked. The stone held. The defenders held. And every failed assault cost the Mongols dozens of warriors they couldn't replace. Contemporary sources tell us that the Mongols suffered heavy casualties and lost several of their leaders trying to take Krakow. Read that sentence again and understand what it means. The Mongols, who had conquered cities from Beijing to Baghdad, who had breached defenses that had stood for centuries, who had overcome every obstacle that defenders could devise, couldn't take Krakow. The capital that had burned twice before stood defiant, its stone walls mocking every assault, its defenders growing more confident with every Mongol failure. On the night of December 29th, something happened that would pass into legend, though historians still debate its accuracy to this day. A group of raftsmen from the village of Zwierzyniec, working-class men who transported goods on the Vistula River, discovered a Mongol encampment 2 miles north of the city. These men, led by a raftsman named Wojcik, tough as old leather and mean as winter wolves, made a decision. They weren't soldiers, they weren't knights. They had no training in warfare, no armor, no proper weapons. But they weren't going to hide in their homes while their city was under siege by invaders who had burned their father's generation alive. On the night of December 30th, 30 men armed with axes and boat hooks, weapons meant for chopping wood and hauling cargo, launched a raid on the Mongol camp. They moved in darkness, using their knowledge of the river to approach undetected, traveling by paths that only local men who had worked these waters their entire lives would know. They hit the camp like a winter storm, sudden, brutal, unexpected. Mongol officers, sleeping in their tents, confident that no one would dare attack a military encampment, died before they could draw weapons. Horses were cut loose, stampeding through the camp. Supply wagons were set on fire. In 15 minutes of chaos, the raftsmen killed several commanders, including, according to legend, the officer commanding siege operations. Then they melted back into the darkness, disappearing along river paths the Mongols didn't know existed, ghosts who struck and vanished. Is it true? Maybe, maybe not. Medieval chronicles often embellished victories and invented heroic tales to inspire future generations. But here's what we know for certain. Something went badly wrong for the Mongols at Krakow that night. Their siege operations, which had been coordinated and professional despite their failures, became disorganized. Officers who should have been planning assaults were dead. Command structure broke down, and Nogai, the brilliant commander who had expected to take the capital in days, who had planned to be withdrawing with treasure by now, made a decision no Mongol commander wanted to make. On January 3, 1288, he abandoned the siege. He didn't retreat entirely. That would have been too humiliating, too much of an admission of complete failure. Instead, he divided his forces into smaller raiding parties and sent them north and south, trying to salvage something from the campaign by plundering the countryside, by gaining at least some treasure and slaves to show the Golden Horde that the expedition hadn't been a complete waste. Inside Krakow, when the Mongol army withdrew, when the siege lifted, and the enemy pulled back, the defenders didn't celebrate. They were too exhausted, too stunned by what they had accomplished. They simply stood on the walls, watching their enemies retreat, trying to believe what had just happened. The city that had been helpless prey twice before, that had burned in 1241 and 1259, had become a fortress that the greatest cavalry force in the world couldn't crack. Leszek stood beside Gryfina on the battlements, looking out at the departing Mongol forces, their camps being struck, their warriors mounting horses, preparing to scatter into raiding parties. Both columns, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of realization. Talabuga defeated at Wonko, Nogai failed here at Krakow. Both their armies broken, scattered into small raiding groups now, separated, vulnerable. Is it over? Gryfina asked. Can we finally rest? Leszek shook his head slowly, his eyes tracking the Mongol movements with the focus of a man who had spent 46 years preparing for this. Not yet, they're still dangerous. Still capable of burning villages and taking slaves. But now they're vulnerable, divided into small groups, frustrated, confused. They came here expecting to be predators. He turned from the walls, his decision made, his next moves already forming in his tactical mind. Now we hunt them. He walked toward the war room, and Gryfina followed. The war wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The Mongols were no longer an unstoppable force sweeping across Poland. They were scattered raiding parties, weakened, divided, operating in hostile territory without coordination or clear objectives. And Leszek the Black had waited half a lifetime to become the hunter. That night, Leszek stood alone in Krakow's war room, looking at maps marked with Mongol positions reported by scouts. Small groups scattered across southern Poland, raiding parties of 100 to 1,000 men, each one isolated, each one vulnerable. For 46 years, he had been afraid. Afraid the nightmare would return, afraid the walls wouldn't hold, afraid he would fail like his uncle had failed at Legnica, like he himself had failed in 1259. Afraid that all his preparation, all the silver marks spent on stone, all the years of planning would prove insufficient. But standing there, with Krakow's stone walls intact and both Mongol columns broken, the fear was gone, replaced by something cold and final and absolutely certain. Not victory yet, but the certainty that victory was coming. He placed a marker on the map at Stary Sącz, where the latest intelligence reported a Mongol detachment of approximately 1,000 warriors besieging the town, isolated, operating independently. Unaware that both their parent columns had been defeated, unaware that the hunters had become the hunted. "Now," he whispered to the empty room, his voice carrying 46 years of preparation and 28 years of obsessive planning, "we finish it." Outside, snow fell on Krakow's stone walls. Inside, Leszek the Black began planning the final moves of a campaign that had started when he was 5 years old, watching his world burn through a crack in stone. The Mongols had come to Poland expecting easy prey. They were about to learn what happens when prey evolves into predator. January 1288, Poland, in deep winter. Snow covered the corpses from December's battles. Ice locked the rivers. The cold was brutal, the kind of cold that killed horses and men who weren't prepared for it. But the Mongols were prepared. They'd campaigned in Siberian winters. They'd crossed the steppes in conditions that would have destroyed European armies. Cold didn't frighten them. What frightened them was something they'd never experienced in Poland before. The hunted had become hunters. Nogai's 10,000 warriors were scattered across southern Poland in raiding parties ranging from 100 to 1,000 men. Each group was supposed to plunder whatever they could find, then rendezvous back at the border by late January. Quick raids, get in, grab valuables, get out. But Poland wasn't the same nation they'd ravaged in 1241 and 1259. The villages had warning systems now, telegraph riders that could alert neighboring settlements within hours. Local militias trained and equipped with crossbows, and, most dangerous of all, mobile cavalry forces that hunted Mongol raiding parties like wolves tracking wounded deer. Talabuga's forces, bloodied and demoralized from Łącko, had already retreated to Köln. The northern column was finished, limping back toward Ruthenia, with nothing to show but casualties and shame. But Nogai's southern raiders were still active, still dangerous, still burning farms and taking slaves, until Stary Sącz, mid-January 1288, the town of Stary Sącz in southern Poland. A Mongol detachment of approximately 1,000 warriors had been besieging this small town for 3 days. It wasn't a major target. The town had maybe 2,000 inhabitants, but it had supplies the raiders needed: food, warm clothing, horses. The Mongol commander, a veteran named Karabuka, expected the town to fall within a week. The garrison was small. The walls were modest stone fortifications, nothing like Krakow's massive defenses. It should have been straightforward. What Karabuka didn't know was that messengers had already ridden from Stary Sącz to both Kraków and the Hungarian border. Messengers carrying one simple message: Mongol force isolated, coordinates provided, come quickly. Leszek received the intelligence on January 10th. He was in Krakow's war room with Pakosław and Zbigniew when the messenger arrived, half frozen from riding through a snowstorm. "How many?" Leszek asked immediately. "Approximately 1,000, my lord, besieging Stary Sącz. No sign of other Mongol forces within 20 miles. Pakosław leaned over the map. "It's a trap. Has to be. They want us to ride out, then hit us in the open. But Leshek was studying the terrain, the distances, the timing. His mind, trained by decades of preparation and study, was calculating. "It's not a trap," he said quietly. "It's an opportunity. They're scattered, frustrated. Nogai probably ordered them to salvage something from this disaster of a campaign. They're not thinking about coordinated tactics anymore. They're just trying to get enough plunder to make the casualties worthwhile." Zbigniew, who had been chafing under Leshek's defensive strategy for weeks, straightened. "So we ride out? We attack?" "We coordinate with Georgi's Hungarians." Leshek's finger traced the route from the Hungarian border to Stary Sonch. "If they move fast, they can be there in 3 days. We can be there in 4. We hit them from 2 sides with 3,000 cavalry." 3,000 against 1,000, Zbigniew said. "Finally, favorable odds." Leshek looked at the young knight with cold eyes. "This isn't about odds. This is about sending a message. We're not just defending anymore. We're hunting, and when we catch them, we destroy them completely. No survivors, no prisoners, nothing." The brutality in his voice silenced the room. This was Leshek the Black at his darkest. 51 years old, 46 years of memory and preparation and rage, all focused on one purpose: make them regret they ever came to Poland. January 15th, 1288. Dawn. Karabuka stood outside his tent, watching his warriors prepare for another day of siege operations. Progress was slow. The defenders of Stary Sonch were surprisingly stubborn, but it was only a matter of time. What he didn't see, hidden in the forest 3 miles to the south, was György Csak's Hungarian cavalry, 1,500 riders who had ridden through the night, silent, waiting. What he didn't see, approaching from the north through a valley screened by hills, was Leszek's force. 1,500 Polish knights and allied cavalry, also silent, also waiting. The attack came at mid-morning when the Mongol camp was at its most active, warriors moving between tents, horses being fed, officers planning the day's assault on the town. György hit from the south. The Hungarians came in a wedge formation, heavy cavalry designed to punch through and shatter. The Mongol pickets had perhaps 30 seconds of warning before 1,500 horses crashed into the southern edge of the camp. Chaos erupted. Warriors scrambled for weapons. Horses panicked. The Mongols tried to form up to create the defensive formations they'd trained for. Then Leszek hit from the north. This was the maneuver Leszek had studied in every chronicle, every survivor's account, the encirclement, the trap the Mongols themselves had perfected. He'd spent 28 years learning how they did it, and now he was using it against them. Karabuka realized what was happening with the clarity of a man watching his own death approach. They were surrounded, 2 forces, coordinated perfectly, attacking from opposite sides. The same tactic the Mongols had used at Legnica, the same tactic that had destroyed Duke Henry. He tried to organize a breakout, tried to rally his warriors for a charge through the enemy lines, but there was no time, no space. The Polish and Hungarian cavalry were already inside the camp, and this wasn't the open-field mobile warfare where Mongols excelled. This was a slaughter in confined quarters. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. Leszek fought in the center of the carnage, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision. He was an old man now by warrior standards. 51, gray-haired, scarred, but every blow carried 46 years of memory behind it. For Krakow, burning when he was 5, strike. For his uncle's head on a pike, strike. For the villages destroyed in 1259, strike. For every lesson learned in blood and ash, strike. Around him, the Mongol resistance collapsed. Warriors who had conquered from China to the Carpathians found themselves on the receiving end of their own tactics. Those who tried to flee were run down by Hungarian cavalry. Those who tried to fight were overwhelmed by Polish knights. When it was over, the snow around Stary Sonch was red for half a mile. Contemporary sources specifically note that the entire Mongol army was completely surprised and annihilated. Their commander was killed. Fewer than 50 warriors escaped to carry news of the disaster back to Nogai. Leshek stood in the center of the destroyed camp, breathing hard, covered in blood that wasn't his own. Pakoswav approached him, leading 2 horses. "Total victory," the old veteran said. "We killed them all." Leshek looked at the carnage around him. 1,000 Mongol warriors dead, the finest cavalry the Golden Horde could field, destroyed in less than 2 hours. "Not victory yet," he said quietly. "Not until they're all gone. Not until they know they can never come back." But even as he said it, he felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been clenched tight for 46 years beginning to loosen. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. Just the first faint sense that maybe, finally, it was over. News of Stary Sonch spread across Poland within days, and more importantly, it spread to what remained of the Mongol invasion force. When word reached Nogai, camped with his remaining forces near the border, the reality of the situation became unavoidable. Talabuga's northern column had been defeated at Wonko and withdrawn. His own siege of Krakow had failed catastrophically. His raiding parties were being hunted and destroyed by coordinated Polish and Hungarian forces. The campaign had become a disaster. On January 20th, 1288, Nogai gave the order to retreat. Full withdrawal back to Ruthenia. No more raiding. No more attempts to salvage the operation. Just get out before more warriors died for nothing. Unlike the previous invasions of 1241 and 1259, this wasn't a victorious army laden with treasure and slaves. This was a defeated force that had failed to achieve any strategic objectives. They'd lost perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 men. They'd gained nothing. No plunder, no glory, no conquest. Just shame and casualties. The Golden Horde's chronicles are tellingly sparse about the 1287 to 1288 Polish campaign. Conquest and glory made for good storytelling. But humiliating defeats? Those got quietly forgotten. But Poland remembered. February 1288. Krakow. Spring was still months away, but the city felt reborn. Merchants reopened shops that had been shuttered during the siege. Families who had fled to the countryside returned. Children played in streets where Mongol arrows had fallen just weeks before. Leshek stood in his private chambers, looking at a sword mounted on the wall. His father's sword. Conrad of Masovia had carried it in the defense of 1241, had died holding it when Leshek was 5. Gryfina found him there staring at the blade. "You did it," she said softly. "Father would be proud." Leshek was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was distant, almost wondering. Father died believing they were unstoppable, that the Mongols were a force of nature like storms or plague, something you could only survive, never defeat. He touched the sword's hilt gently. "I lived long enough to prove him wrong." "At what cost?" Gryfina asked. She gestured around the room. Spartan, functional. The room of a man who had spent his life preparing for war rather than living. 28 years, Leshek. You bankrupted the duchy treasury 3 times. You never married, never had children. You spent your entire adult life preparing for 46 days of fighting. Was it worth it? Leshek turned to face his sister. You tell me. Would you rather I had lived a comfortable life and watched Krakow burn for a 3rd time? Watched more children hide in cellars while their world ended? Gryfina had no answer to that. Leshek walked to the window, looking out over the stone walls that had saved his city. Every silver mark spent on these walls was worth it. Every year of preparation was necessary. Every moment of obsession was justified. He paused. Because it worked. They came with 30,000 warriors. They left with nothing but corpses and shame. And they'll never come back? They'll never come back, Leshek said it with absolute certainty. We taught them what happens when you underestimate your enemy, when you assume past victories guarantee future success. They learned the lesson. It cost them blood and pride. They won't forget. He was right. After 1288, the Mongol Golden Horde never invaded Poland again. Not once. The nation that had been easy prey for half a century suddenly became a territory they wanted nothing to do with. March 1288. A war council, but this time without the urgency of impending invasion. Leszek sat with his commanders, reviewing casualty reports and damage assessments. The numbers told a story that still seemed impossible. Polish military casualties, approximately 1,200 dead, most at Łącko, where close-quarters combat had been brutal. But 1,200 against an invasion force of 30,000 was astonishingly low. Mongol casualties estimated 8 to 10,000, heavy losses for a raid that had gained them nothing. Civilian casualties remarkably light. The fortified cities had protected populations that in previous invasions would have been massacred or enslaved. Zbigniew, who had fought at both Łącko and Stary Sącz, spoke up. What did we do differently? Why did it work this time? It was Pakosław who answered, the old veteran who had fought in 1259 and lived to see victory in 1288. We learned, he said simply. We analyzed our defeats. We understood why we lost, and we spent decades fixing our vulnerabilities. That's what we did differently. Leszek nodded slowly. The Mongols had one fundamental flaw. They assumed their past victories guaranteed future success. They came to Poland expecting 1241 and 1259 to repeat themselves. Easy plunder, scattered resistance, quick victory. And we gave them something completely different, Zbigniew said. We gave them walls they couldn't burn, defenders who wouldn't panic, tactics designed specifically to counter theirs, and most importantly, Leszek paused, making sure every man in the room understood this point. We used their own division against them. Talabuga and Nogai hated each other too much to coordinate. That rivalry killed their campaign before it began. The lesson hung in the air. Unity of command matters. Division destroys armies from within. But there was a deeper lesson too, one that Leszek had learned in the root cellar 47 years ago, watching Krakow burn through a crack in the stone. Adaptation is survival. The months that followed brought political changes that had been building for decades. The Mongol invasions had exposed the fatal weakness of Poland's fragmented structure, multiple dukes ruling separate territories with no unified command. The 1287 to 1288 campaign had shown what could be achieved when Polish forces coordinated under a single strategic vision. The momentum toward reunification, which had been slowly building since the disasters of the mid-13th century, gained unstoppable strength. Within a generation, Poland would crown its first king in decades. The Mongol threat had forged Polish national identity in ways nothing else could have. But Leszek wouldn't see it. He died in late 1288, just months after his greatest victory. He was 52 years old. The official cause was illness, but those close to him suspected something else. For 46 years, he had lived with one purpose. Once that purpose was fulfilled, there was nothing left driving him forward. Gryfina was with him at the end. So was Pakosław. In his final hours, Leszek asked to be carried to the window where he could see Krakow's stone walls one last time. "Did I do right?" he asked his sister. "Was it worth the cost?" Gryfina looked at her brother, at the man who had sacrificed everything to protect his people. "The walls still stand," she said. "The city lives. Children play in streets that should have burned. Yes, Leszek, you did right." He died that night peacefully, with the stone walls of Krakow visible from his window. 7 centuries later, the laconic tradition continues in Krakow. Every year on the first Thursday after Corpus Christi, a man dressed in elaborate Oriental costume rides a hobby horse through the streets, followed by musicians and revelers. The parade celebrates the legendary raftsman who raided the Mongol camp outside Krakow's walls in December 1287. Whether Wojciech and his 30 companions actually killed Mongol commanders that night, historians still debate. But the accuracy hardly matters anymore. What matters is what the tradition represents: the transformation of terror into triumph, the refusal to be victims, the stubborn Polish insistence that they would not be conquered. The stone walls Leszek built stood for centuries. Some still stand today in Krakow's old town, monuments to one man's obsessive preparation. Tourists walk past them daily without knowing the full story, without understanding that those walls represent 46 years of a life spent refusing to make the same mistake 3 times. Leszek the Black spent 28 years preparing for 46 days of fighting. Most would call that obsession. Historical records show he bankrupted his duchy's treasury 3 times. He never married, never had children, never knew peace. But because of that obsession, Krakow stands today. Because of those stone walls, thousands of lives were saved in 1287. Because of one man's refusal to accept defeat, Poland learned it could survive anything. The Mongol Empire, which had conquered from the Pacific to the Danube, learned its limits. The unstoppable force discovered it could be stopped, not by matching its strength, but by learning faster. That's the lesson that transcends medieval warfare. That's the legacy that matters 700 years later. Strategic patience defeats tactical aggression. Institutional preparation outlasts individual heroism. Defensive advantage enables offensive opportunity. Understanding your enemy's internal divisions matters as much as understanding their tactics. And above all, adaptation beats strength every single time. Think about what Leszek accomplished. A 5-year-old boy watched his world burn, watched his uncle beheaded, watched his father broken by defeat. Most people would be destroyed by that trauma, would spend their lives trying to forget. Leszek spent his life making sure it never happened again. Was the cost too high? Did he sacrifice too much? Only you can answer that. But consider what he achieved. An empire that had never been stopped in Poland was stopped. A force that had devastated his nation twice learned to fear it. Children who should have died as slaves grew old in their own homes. The stone walls still stand in Krakow. They stand as monuments to a simple truth. The greatest victory is sometimes learning faster than your enemy. The strongest army means nothing if you can't adapt when circumstances change. Leszek II didn't defeat the Mongols with better cavalry or more men. He defeated them by spending 46 years refusing to make the same mistake 3 times. Sometimes survival requires more than courage. It requires the discipline to prepare when others want to forget. The wisdom to build walls when others want to build armies. The patience to wait decades for the moment when preparation meets opportunity. That's the lesson of the last Mongol invasion. That's the legacy of the boy who watched his world burn and spent his life making sure it never burned again. The stone walls still stand. And they always will.